Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm gonna be talking about somebody that nobody asked me to talk about, but it is something that I personally do find quite fascinating and interesting, and I do think it is worth pointing your attention to. You see, in Amalgams of Champions, among many other different setups, kind of like implied rules that we all kind of naturally accept, class archetypal abilities is one of them. Like, we're always quite surprised when specific type of abilities appear on a champion of a class that it doesn't necessarily belong to. And that often comes like as a surprise, or just Kabam trying to stick closer to a specific lore, for instance. Like, recently we have had some science champions that seem to have access to stagger, and therefore access to buff control, which is typically kind of reserved to be specifically mystic ability. And at the same time, we have long had some and few of these champions that pretty much completely defy their class archetype, and it almost seems that the only connection that they actually have with their class archetype is their MCOC lore, story, and background, and pretty much nothing else in their abilities. So, to kind of like narrow down exactly what I mean, and then point out the specific champions that I think are still phenomenal champions, partially because they define the class archetype, because we're gonna go over the benefits and the downsides of it as well in a second. But let's just cover all the classes, and what I am going to talk about is kind of like specifically exemplified, I think, in last 3 or 4 years, because it has been, you know, much more strongly implemented than previously, perhaps. You see, Mystic class. What is the idea of Mystic class? What do you think are the abilities that the Mystic champions have, typically a default random unknown Mystic champion? Well, you always pretty much think of buff control and or power control. Now, seemingly, Mystics have moved away from power control from the earlier times. As you can see, out of all of these champions right here, only Mangog really has like a proper power control. And then there is Sorcerer Supreme, who does have slight power control. And then you could kind of argue with Dragon Man and America Chavez, both kind of unique, but those are definitely not like the core aspects of their abilities. So previously Mystics were buff and power control. Now they have moved into a direction where basically they interact with buffs, whether they bring their own or not, but majority of the Mystic abilities gets fueled by opponents having buffs, and then your abilities interacting with them, giving you extra power, triggering your abilities, or what have you. Cosmic Champions is fairly straightforward. Virtually every champion in Cosmic class has access to several attack modifiers and alternate damage dealing options. If you're going to take a look at all of these champions, and pretty much all of them have some sort of fury buffs, or other ways how to amplify the damage, typically perhaps armor break or something. But primarily it's always fury and fairly buff heavy, buff intensive champions in Cosmic class. As in, like, lots of buffs, lots of damage. Tech class, on the other hand, typically revolves around armor up effects and power control these days. You can see that every single one of these champions does have access to some sort of power control. I suppose Set Silver Centurion? No, wait, even he does, I think, on level 3, if I'm not mistaken. Let's take a quick glance. With power and debuff, yes, even he does. So there you go. Not the best, but still. And then we have Mutant Champions. Mutant Champions, again, specifically, especially in the last couple of years, always revolve around prowess effects, big special attack damage, and perhaps some regeneration capabilities. And that you can see throughout here. Then we have skill class that typically revolves against purifying debuffs, or otherwise, you know, shrugging them off or cleansing them. And then typically either it is some sort of ability accuracy reduction, perhaps evade prevention, or some damage over time effects. And then we have science class that's just all about utility-wide debuffs. It's very rare that you can see any buffs on the science champion. I think, in fact, only champions in this entire lineup here in the last 3 years that can actually gain a buff without with their inherent own abilities would be Mr. Negative, obviously heavy attack Fury that he often gets rid of quite quickly, and Overseer with the Fury buff as well. But all of the utility here of all of these champions is always tied behind some sort of debuffs that give them extra utility typically. So, there are, however, some very powerful champions in almost every class that completely defy the class archetypes, and I think it is important to acknowledge that, because it does come with specific downsides, especially recently, but it also offers you very specific upsides. For instance, we have KVQ nodes or Act 7 nodes and presumably Act 8 nodes as well that specifically are themed for you to use a set class champions. And then in order to actually benefit there, it's not enough that your champion is of a specific class, you need to be able to trigger specific abilities. For instance, you have tech KVQ nodes, which all of them pretty much involve some sort of form of power control or armor buff or access to shock or something of the sort, but you do need to have one of those pivotal abilities there in order to benefit. So if a champion doesn't have anything really in common with the rest of the tech class, tech archetype, then they can't benefit from any of that. And that is something that Kabam has been pushing especially hard in the last couple of years with the update to KVQ nodes, with Act 7, so on and so forth. But at the same time, whenever there is more challenging content where Kabam often tries to set up traps and forces or encourages you to use specific class champions, they always or often try to put on specific counters as well to that. As in, like, you need to use tech champion, but they're going to put on a champion on a lane that's, for instance, power burn immune or something like that, or power control immune. Then all of a sudden, majority of the tech class doesn't really work, but there's still a handful of champions that can. Either way, you guys are going to catch on what I'm trying to message here in a second. So first, let's take a look at science class. So which science class champion defies the class archetype the most that's still good? And to be clear, we're not talking about super outdated champions from 2014 or 15 that have like 5 abilities in their kit, because, in that case, you can definitely find more. But which science class champion completely defies the class archetype? Obviously, one of them is Quake, but we're going to put Quake aside because Quake... Okay, fine. Quake is one of them, because if opponents are even debuff immune, which typically means that about 9 out of 10 science champions would lose vast majority of their utility, Quake can still be used. But the main champion that I wanted to focus here is Red Hulk, because Red Hulk doesn't place any debuffs on the opponent at all, really. I think he can place an Incinerate with level 3, but nobody ever does that. And aside from that one debuff that he can place on the opponent on level 3, he does none of that stuff. He has his immunities, he has high damage output with his secondary damage, which means he can bypass some damage caps, so on and so forth, and that's it. Red Hulk is almost as simple of a champion as you can get, that's still extremely effective, and seemingly has nothing more in common with the science class than the icon itself. Because every science champion these days heavily relies on access to debuffs for their utility and or damage or their overall rotations and kit. Red Hulk is borderline impossible to work with that, because the only debuff that you will be applying in an average fight is going to be the parry stun. And why is this good? Is because these classes and class archetypes, besides of what I mentioned before, how it can hinder the champions and so forth, but also it typically gives these champions much better ability to fight at a class disadvantage, when you would have to use a science champion to take on a skill class champion, for instance. If you're going to be going up against Kingpin, well then, many of these are automatically invalidated. Red Hulk isn't bothered, because none of the Kingpin's abilities really matter to Red Hulk. So I do think that Red Hulk does have somewhat special place in science class, and I do want to highlight it. And I'm gonna flat out say it's very, very convenient and good to have access to a Red Hulk for your account, for specifically the reasons that I have outlined so far. In skill class, to be honest, I don't think we have any champion that completely defies the class archetype that's not absolutely outdated. So I don't think there's too much to highlight here. If I would have to highlight, the thing that I have noticed is perhaps Hawkeye, because Hawkeye does have inherent power control that is reliable and stable, and that is extremely unique in skill class. Aside from Hawkeye, we have Winter Soldier, who's just a junky champion to begin with, and his power control is fairly random. And then we have Moon Knight, who can affect combat power rate. And besides that, there's pretty much nothing of the sort. So Hawkeye, I do still think, is somewhat unique. But other than that, there's nothing really typically, because everything that has been released recently and previous times, again, does incorporate a mixture of ability to shut down opponents' evades, or has access damage over time effects at some meaningful capacity, or guaranteed crits, or shrug off abilities. That's typically, skill class is kind of a bit broad, I think. But let's talk about mutants now. So, if you think, which mutant that is still good, popular, used, defies the class archetype the most? Which mutant has the least amount of abilities in common with the rest of the mutant class? And this is something that I have definitely mentioned and talked about quite frequently. That absolutely is Omega Red. Because Omega Red has virtually none of the common mutant characteristics that Kabam has been forcing. Because mutants have been all around big special attack damage, and Omega Red doesn't care about it, to be honest. Like, in many fights, you don't even want to or have to use special attacks with Omega Red. He doesn't have any access to prowess, and even if he did, it wouldn't affect his damage output too much. Therefore, even if he would benefit from many of the nodes, for instance, in KVQ, that are aimed at mutant champions, they don't really do all that much for Omega Red. At the same time, he has no regen buffs. He has regen effects, but they never actually manifest as any passives or active buffs. Therefore, they also typically do not interact with any of those abilities. And additionally, it's a very good reason why Omega Red, with the exception of specifically robot type of champions, has zero problem fighting against tech class. He just doesn't really care in most cases. Like, if we have champions that prevent you from gaining power or doing much special attack damage, he isn't going to care about that at all. The class advantage is, borderline irrelevant. The robots do pose a problem, obviously, against him. But then, if you look at the rest of the tech archetype, you can easily use Omega Red, for instance, against Captain America Sam Wilson, should you choose to. You can use Omega Red against Guardian. You can use Omega Red against Penny Parker. I have in past to nuke that down. Only thing that you do need to be wary of, obviously, is robots, because that's his inherent weakness that does kind of like precede that class relationship. But at the same time, often Kabam limits mutants' powers by limiting special attack damage, or, nullifying or inflicting cowardice and things like that. And none of that really matters to Omega Red. Therefore, again, he's in a situation where there are plenty of downsides of Omega Red's kit not being necessarily compatible with the rest of the mutant class, but there are also significant upsides to that. Moving on to tech class, which tech champion has least amount in common with the rest of the tech archetype? So again, what do we think of when we think of tech champions? We think of armor up effects, buffs or passives, abilities that often revolve around your armor. We do think of power control. That is kind of like the defining tech ability, I suppose. And then more so recently, I suppose, shock ability. Shocks are kind of fairly common. So which champion has absolutely nothing, and I mean nothing, in common with the rest of the tech class? That's still obviously good and amazing and useful. And it's quite obviously Ghost. Think about it. Ghost, sounds nothing and acts nothing like a tech champion. Only ability that kind of lets Ghost somewhat elude that she would be a tech champion is the fact that she has weakness against armor breaks. And that is kind of like one of the tech things. Aside from that, there's nothing. Because she can't gain armor ups. She can't power control at all whatsoever. And yeah, what else? She doesn't have access to any damage or time effects. None of that thing. What she does, she prevents evades, she has guaranteed crits, and she basically purifies damage or time effects on her. You can't tell me that doesn't sound like skill archetype through and through. Because that's what skill champions do. They purify debuffs. Some of them specifically non-damaging, some of them specifically damaging, some of them all of them. So in Ghost case, that would be all the damage or time effects. Purified ability, check. Guaranteed crits is becoming kind of like more and more common ability, or high crit rate at the very least. And that we can see with Shang-Chi, that we can see with Misty Knight, that we can see with Jabari Panther and Hitmonkey, and, you know, Black Cat has quite a lot of crit abilities in her kit. That's becoming kind of like more staple there as well. And evade prevention, which always has been kind of like one of the things for science class. So Ghost 100% has way more in common with skill class than she does with tech class. It's kind of interesting considering that Ghost, you know, lives at the top of the tech class. It's kind of always been a bit ironic that the best tech champion in the game has nothing to do with tech champions. Okay, Cosmic. And Cosmic also doesn't have any champion that really springs out that would be kind of like good, great, popular Cosmic champion that has very little or nothing to do with Cosmic abilities, typically. Because Cosmic abilities largely are defined by lots of buffs, most commonly Fury, and lots of armor breaks. The thing that is, however, quite unique from all of the newer champions is Null. And I do know that he obviously still has armor breaks and he relies on armor breaks for a large amount of damage. But it's not like Cosmic is the only class that holds, you know, has access to armor breaks typically. But he has zero reliance on any of the buffs. And that is extremely unusual to any Cosmic champion released in many years. If you would put on something like Fisticuffs or something, I don't know, buff immunity on any single one of these other champions, they would be immediately gimped. Like Airwalker doesn't get his power gain and whatever buff. Annihilus can't get his Furies and stuff. CMM can't get her Furies. Cosmic Ghost Rider obviously crits, precision, and Furies. Thanos' favors. You can't do anything without having access to buffs. Neither can he. Hercules kind of, well, still can work somewhat without buffs, which is also one of the better strengths for Hercules, I think, in my opinion, but still he does rely on them, especially Immortality. Again, Hulkling is nothing without his buffs, Icarus is nothing without his buffs, Nova also, same with Odin, same with everybody else. Every other champion in the Cosmic class that has been released in the recent years is nothing without their buffs, aside from Null. Null is the only Cosmic champion that has been released anytime recently that can easily work under some sort of permanent nullification. For instance, if you were to use a champion against a very stacked Doctor Strange that continuously just nullifies all your buffs. Null is, you know, pretty much the only one that would do really well, or would have the least amount of disruption. And that leaves us with the last class, and Mystic class also, actually, it was quite hard to find a champion that has pretty much nothing or no special interaction with buffs specifically. Because as I mentioned, earlier Mystic champions often had some sort of power control and or buff control. Power control used to be as big of an aspect of Mystic champions previously as buff control was. As we can see by, for instance, Symbiote Supreme has some power control. We have Hood with some power control. Scarlet Witch has some power control. Then we have Mephisto Magic with some power control. And Dormammu and Dr. Voodoo have excellent power control. And then if we're going to take a look at the last 4 years, then very, very few of them have power control abilities, especially direct power drains. You might have interactions with ability power gain or reducing opponent's combat power rate, but you don't really have like a solid power gain base aside from Claire and Doom. So I guess I should say last 3 years here. But virtually all of the Mystic champions do interact with opponents having buffs and get significantly more powerful when opponents have active buffs. I suppose, except the champions that kind of associate least. And I'm not going to mention Iron Fist, but ironically, even Iron Fist has some nullify abilities, but he's clearly just outdated. You know, there's just no abilities. But I think not many people know that Iron Fist can nullify Cruelty, Fury, or Precisions with his heavies. So that's something. Kind of like Wiccan, similar. But the champion I think that is the most atypical Mystic champion right now, arguably, would be Guillotine. Guillotine only really has one ability that kind of interacts with opponents having buffs, and it's not even like super important or anything. The only thing is that on critical hits you have 35% chance to inflict a bleed debuff plus 5% chance for each buff on the opponent. That's not overly powerful ability to begin with, and it's barely relevant to her kit, or you know, it doesn't make much of a difference, I would say. And nothing else in her kit really resembles a Mystic champion. There are no power control abilities, power drain or power gain mitigation or anything of the sort. There are absolutely no nullification abilities. And what she does is lots of damage over time, heal reversal, and regeneration. Which kind of would make her, I don't know, more similar to a mutant champion perhaps, or a skill champion maybe. But definitely there's very little of any mystic abilities in Guillotine's kit, I would argue. And yeah, I think that is about it. Another champion that I consider about mentioning is Ghost Rider, even though he does have some power and buff control. But Ghost Rider is one of those champions that really doesn't care whether his opponents have buffs. But I think Guillotine still has to be the one that gets the shout out. So let me know what you guys think. Which champions are the most, I don't know, atypical? The rule breakers? The ones that defy the class archetypes and feel like nothing of a champion that should belong to that class. And I hope you guys found this topic interesting. You guys heard my thoughts. I look forward to hearing yours. So yeah. Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about the next